Bobby Kennedy had a reputation as a tough and even ruthless politician. But this week's guest describes a man whose evolution into a liberal icon was grounded in a personal authenticity. He's Larry Tye this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. Alongside me is my friend and co-host G. Wayne Miller from the Providence Journal. Story in the Public Square is an effort to study, celebrate, and tell stories that matter. We do that by visiting each week with the best contemporary storytellers, authors, scholars, filmmakers, and journalists, really anyone using narrative to explain the world we live in. This week we're joined by best-selling author and journalist Larry Tye. Larry, it's a thrill to have you with us. You've got a distinguished career in journalism, an award-winning journalist with the Boston Globe, a best-selling author. A couple of years ago, you published Bobby Kennedy, The Making of a Liberal Icon, which is the definitive biography of Bobby Kennedy. There's so much we want to talk with you about today, but let's start with the biography of Bobby. He is a giant figure to this day in American politics. In families like mine, he's still revered, still loved. Why write this book? Why write it now?
Writing it was because I think that the story of Bobby is the story of political transformation and of political growth. It's a story of a guy who started out as a protege of Joe McCarthy and ended up an extraordinary liberal icon. And that kind of a trajectory is one we don't often see in politics, where somebody doesn't just flip-flop, but actually changes positions as the country is changing. He was a lens into what was going on in America in the conservative era of Eisenhower and how we got to the tumultuous 1960s. And he's an incredibly resonant voice today, when a bridge builder like him is something a lot of us dream about.
Well, so I worked for a guy who had the moniker of flip-flopper hung on him in the 2004 campaign, and that hurt, right? That was something that was not celebrated in American politics right now. But you're talking about the evolution of someone's political conscience, right?
You are, and you worked for a guy in 2004 whose role model was Bobby Kennedy. That was John Kerry, and I don't think it's an accident that John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama all looked to Bobby Kennedy as a role model, because he was the kind of tough liberal that all of them dreamed about, with an emphasis on the tough side in terms of being able to get things done, and an emphasis on the side of being a liberal who came to it not through a straight line, but through an interesting trajectory that put him at a point where he remains a model half a century after his death.
I guess the question I want to ask, though, is what does it say about our politics now? That it seems like if you evolve on an issue, it's seen as a sign of weakness or political opportunism rather than just an organic evolution of your thinking on an issue.
Sure.
Does it say as much about the times as it does the individuals?
Well, it says about our times that we're looking for somebody who is authentic in an era where we talk about things like fake news, that this was a politician who represented authenticity in a way that few politicians then or now do. But I think it suggests that the model that he gave us in 1968, he was on the cusp, I think, of uniting angry, white, Donald Trump kinds of voters, the kinds of people who were with him from back in his Joe McCarthy era, with Hillary Clinton's coalitions of minorities and liberals, in a way that was truly building bridges. He had come from one world politically, he moved into another one, and he brought people with him because I think he talked hard and difficult truths, and people wanted a truth teller.
So I think most people know Bobby Kennedy as the liberal icon, as the subtitle of your book indicates. Unless your book has been read, I think fewer people might know how he went from a protege of McCarthy to that. How do you make that transformation? That's quite a journey.
you make it partly by being open to what you're experiencing. And Bobby Kennedy was a guy who learned best not by reading the way his brother Jack did, not by being out there and philosophizing about things. It was by experiencing things. And this was a guy who had incredible experiences. He worked for Joe McCarthy, the ultimate table-thumping Cold Warrior, but he went after that and worked in the Senate as a staff aide, the critical staff aide for a guy named John McClellan, who was doing the things that McCarthy told us he was doing but wasn't, was really trying to root out corruption and deception. He went to become his brother's political kingmaker in his campaigns for Congress and for Senator and the White House. And he went to be Attorney General, starting out as maybe the most clueless guy to ever go into that office. Jack Kennedy used to joke that he wanted to give his little brother, a little legal experience, so he named him Attorney General. And Bobby went in knowing nothing on issues that were critical to America back then, like civil rights. And by the end of his 3-year tenure, he was, I would argue, maybe the greatest Attorney General in the modern American history.
So moving past that joke, why did Jack Kennedy make him Attorney General?
Because his dad, Joe Kennedy, told him to do it. And I think Joe Kennedy wanted Bobby to be Attorney General, not to go on and do great things for civil rights or attacking organized crime. He wanted him to be Attorney General to have Jack's back. He wanted Jack Kennedy to have somebody in his cabinet who was there to protect Big Brother Jack and to make him a great president. And it ended up becoming, in a way that not even Joe Kennedy could have anticipated, Bobby Kennedy, during his years as Attorney General, was Jack Kennedy's #1 advisor on all the obvious issues, on organized crime, on civil rights, but he was also on issues like the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was Jack's most trusted aide. He was the closest thing that America has ever seen and might ever see to being a co-president.
Wow. Well, the history of the two brothers and their the trust that they had in each other, particularly in the moment of the Cuban Missile Crisis, is central to that not ending very, very badly with mushroom clouds on Cuban beaches.
It is. On the other hand, Bobby Kennedy, as was his wont, gave us a story that was largely a fib in what was the closest thing we had at the time to the official history of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was a book that Bobby wrote called 13 Days, right. And the hero of that book was not Jack Kennedy, it was his young Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy. And he was the hero because he supposedly took us to this wonderful middle ground of blockading rather than attacking Cuba. And it was a very convincing story until the actual tapes of what went on in the cabinet room came out. And they showed that for the first 6 or 7 days of that 13 days, the one who was most ardently calling for let's invade, let's attack Cuba, was a guy named Bobby Kennedy. And Bobby Kennedy, in the end, was his brother's best advocate for the blockade. But like many things in Bobby Kennedy's life, where he ended up was not where he started out, and where he started out was not his proudest moment.
So there's a real tragic irony here. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated 50 years ago. His brother was assassinated in 1963. How did Bobby react to that? And obviously he had no way of foretelling his own fate, but how did he react to his brother being shot and killed in Dallas?
So if there was a single epiphany moment in Bobby's life, it was that moment when he had come from a hard morning of work at the Justice Department to do what he often did, which was get driven at midday from the Justice Department to the family estate in this wonderful Hickory Hill. He had just gotten out of the swimming pool when the phone rang, and Ethel holds up the phone and says, "Bobby, it's J. Edgar Hoover." And Bobby's stomach sinks. He knew that J. Edgar Hoover would never be calling him for anything good. And Hoover says, "Your brother has been shot in Dallas." An hour later, another call comes in and says, "Your brother is dead." And this was a moment where in an instant, Bobby had lost his best friend, his whole political purpose in life, and he had lost his sense of what he was to do in the world. And he went through a period, he went for a month rallying in a way that he brought the Kennedy family together and brought the country together and got them over this extraordinary tragedy. But at the end of the month, when the Kennedys and when the country was starting to pull it together, Bobby started a period of about 6 months of what Ethel describes half a century later as serious clinical depression. He wasn't sure whether he wanted to stay in public life. He He wasn't sure that he didn't want to take Papa Joe's money and go travel the world. And at the end of that period, he decided to re-engage with the world by running for senator from New York. And he developed a whole different sense of purpose in life, I think. For the first half of his political life, he had been, we all are some blend of tough and tender. And for Bobby's early life, from the Joe McCarthy period through his attorney generalship, the dial was on the tough side. The press branded him as ruthless, and they weren't that far off the mark. From the moment of his brother's assassination until his own assassination 5 years later, the dial was moving ever more to the side of being tender, of being empathetic, of understanding. His sister-in-law Jackie had him reading Greek tragedies, and he saw in those Greek tragedies the story of the Kennedys. It was a family that could have everything, and in a moment it could all come crashing down. And Bobby started from that time on empathizing with the underdog that was reflected in his relationship with the black world in America. And by the end of his life, I would argue that he was the single most popular white man in black America. It suggested that he could empathize with farm workers, with Native Americans. It changed. His brother's death started this cycle that made him one of the most compelling and empathetic figures in American political history.
So one of the most remarkable moments in American political history, and I'm thinking of the night that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and Bobby's supposed to have a campaign rally. Is it in Indianapolis?
It was.
And he gets up there, and the crowd doesn't know. And he realizes that the crowd doesn't know.
So can I take you back quickly?
Please.
7 years before. 7 years before Bobby starts out as Attorney General, he knows nothing about civil rights. He had grown up in two of the whitest, most privileged places on earth, Hyannisport and Palm Beach, Florida. And he's entrusted essentially with the nation's civil rights policy as Attorney General. And at a moment when most of the civil rights leaders in America were despairing, thinking he was as clueless as he was, one guy stood up and said, no, there is deep within this guy, Bobby Kennedy, good, and it's up to us to pull it out of him. And that was a young civil rights leader named Martin Luther King Jr. 7 years later, just how prophetic he was became clear that night in Indianapolis. Bobby Kennedy was campaigning for president. He flies into Indianapolis on a plane called the Caroline. He lands at the airport, and the young mayor, who went on to become an old senator from Indiana named Richard Lugar, greets Bobby and says, you are due tonight to speak in the middle of the black community at a rally. You're not going to do that. You're not going to do that because if you go in there, I'm not sure you're going to come out alive, and if you go in there, there will be a riot. Bobby listens to the advice, and he proceeds to do exactly the opposite of what Lugar says. He drives into the ghetto. He takes his staff's prepared remarks, crumples them up and throws them away. And for the next 5 minutes, he gives what I think was the most pitch-perfect speech that any politician, and certainly a white politician to a black audience, has ever given. By the end of his 5-minute talk, that community, instead of him going in there to embrace them for the loss of Martin Luther King Jr., he talked that night for the first time since his brother's death publicly about what it felt like to lose his brother. He couldn't bring himself to say Jack or my brother. He said a member of my family died in the same tragic way, and I can understand what you're going through. At the end of his talk, instead of him embracing the community for the loss of Martin Luther King, they were embracing him for the loss of Jack Kennedy. Back somewhere in that audience that night, there was a little sign that went up that said something that sounds very modest 50 years later. It said, white, but all right. And that same sign, a sign saying those words, everywhere Bobby spoke, from that night in April of '68 to his death in June of '68, there was a sign in the black community that went up and said the same thing. It is not hyperbole to say that he was the singly most popular white man in black America because he understood and could relate to people with their loss and people who came from an entirely different world than he did. So Martin Luther King tragically was proven right the night of his own death at just what potential there was in this guy, Bobby Kennedy.
What happened the night Bobby was assassinated? Bring us back there.
So Bobby just wins the biggest political victory of his life. He wins the California presidential primary. he gets on stage and delivers one of the most fun and optimistic speeches that he had ever delivered. And he leaves the stage with these words, "It is on to Chicago." And what most people who heard him say that assumed that he meant was, it's on to that summer's convention, the Democratic Convention in Chicago. What he really meant, as Bill Daley explained to me, was on to Chicago the next day to meet with Bill Daley's father, the then powerful mayor of Chicago named Richard Daley. Richard Daley was planning that next day to endorse Bobby Kennedy for president. If you remember back 50 years ago, there was no more powerful establishment figure in America than the powerful mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley.
Right.
I'm convinced that Richard Daley's endorsement would have set off a wave of endorsements by other big city mayors and by other Democratic power brokers. And I'm totally convinced the ticket that year, the Democratic ticket, would have been Kennedy for president, Humphrey for vice president. Had they taken on Richard Nixon, you'll remember that Richard Nixon came within a whisker of losing to Hubert Humphrey. Had the ticket been Kennedy-Humphrey, had they not had the riots, and they wouldn't have had the riots at the Chicago Convention, and you'll remember also that the one person in America who understood Richard Nixon's vulnerabilities better than anyone else was the guy who had run his brother Jack's successful campaign against Nixon 8 years before. I think that Bobby Kennedy would not only have beat Richard Nixon, I think he would have beat him by a sizable margin, and I'm totally convinced that he would have tried in the first 5 minutes of his presidency to do the things that Jack Kennedy was waiting until his second term to do, which is to give us a strong civil rights bill, to wage a war against poverty, and maybe most importantly, to get us out of Vietnam. He would have been a very different president, and instead what happened that night in California was Bobby Kennedy got down from the podium. It was one of the few moments in the campaign where his one real bodyguard, an ex-FBI agent named Bill Barry, wasn't with him. Bobby had said to Barry, "You stay behind and help my pregnant wife Ethel off the stage." So Bobby goes against the advice of his bodyguard, walks through a shortcut to get to the waiting press through the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel, and the rest was a tragic history. He's gunned down at the moment of his greatest hope.
It's a moment in American history we're never going to forget. The Los Angeles Review of Books called your book, Bobby Kennedy, quote, "a compelling story of how idealism can be cultivated and liberalism learned." I'm thinking about the world we inhabit today and sort of a longing for those types of characteristics in any leader. And what's the message for today?
The message is as clear as it could ever be. The message is the way we move ahead as a country and the way we get inspired again about politics is to have somebody in the Bobby Kennedy mold who is trying to build bridges, who doesn't give up on the conservatives that one would assume that a liberal icon would have despaired of ever reaching out to. Bobby Kennedy in 1968 did an extraordinary thing that had all the cynical journalists who didn't like him at the start of the campaign falling in love with him by the end. And what he did was he told the truth. He would go into black communities in 68 at a time when there were riots in the streets. He would go in and say to them just the thing they didn't want to hear, which is, number one, we need safe streets. And then he would say the second half of his message, which is the way we get safe streets is to have racial tolerance and racial reconciliation. He would go in and give exactly the opposite message, or the opposite order of that message, to white communities. He would say, number one, we need racial justice. And the way we get racial justice is to have safe streets. He would tell both communities the hard truth they didn't want to hear. It was exactly the opposite of the demagoguery we hear today. And maybe naively, but I'm convinced that if we had a politician who told us the difficult truth today, we'd be so shocked that we might actually believe them and want to follow them.
So the question is, do we have any political leaders like that, or any political leaders in the making like that?
So I'm going to give you an answer that is only partly in jest, which is Don't despair in the Kennedys giving us another political leader like that. The closest thing, and you don't want to believe me, the closest thing that Grandmother Ethel, Bobby's widow, says that the Kennedys have produced to Bobby is a young congressman from Massachusetts named Joe Kennedy III, who is trying in his brief career in Congress to reach across the aisle and do the kind of reconciliation that his grandfather did 50 years before. And it doesn't have to be somebody named Kennedy. There are lots of politicians out there who are doing the same thing and who aren't getting credit. And I could give you names, but I think we all have our list. And the good news is we've got a long time that we can test the waters and see who does it. But I would suggest that any of them study the political history of Bobby Kennedy and study the way he won over not just the cynical press corps, but two parts of America to a message of reconciliation.
I mean, you're describing, so there are critics of Bobby Kennedy who might take issue with some of your interpretation, right? The people who see him as ruthless and really sort of, particularly as Attorney General, mostly interested in his brother's success. But you make a compelling case about the evolution of the individual. And what you're describing really, though, is a person of virtue. Where did that come from? Is this part of his upbringing, part of how he was raised? Where did this come from?
So can I tell you that, answer that by trying to tell you a brief story?
Sure.
And it's a story about a reporter at the Washington Post named Richard Black Death Harwood. And Dick Harwood was a guy, he was called Black Death, he was an ex-Marine, and he was called Black Death because anybody that he found doing anything wrong, it was death to them. He was likely going to put them in jail or expose them. And the editor of the Washington Post back in '68, a guy named Ben Bradley, appointed Black Death Harwood to cover Bobby Kennedy because he thought this is the one guy that's never going to fall in love with him. Harwood's first experience with Bobby Kennedy during the campaign was in a game of touch football, the press versus Bobby's crew. And Harwood came back with a bloody nose and was convinced that Bobby Kennedy played dirty on the football field as well as in politics. So he hated Bobby Kennedy, and he was the guy who all the labels of ruthless and all the bad things that Bobby had begun with, Harwood believed. By the end of the campaign, Harwood went to Ben Bradley and said, "You got to take me off this campaign because I've fallen in love with Bobby Kennedy." Harwood ended up writing the most magnificent of all the eulogies delivered on Bobby Kennedy. And the reason Harwood fell in love with Bobby Kennedy was he saw precisely what we were discussing a few minutes ago. He saw Bobby go in and tell people just what they didn't want to hear, but do it in a way that was so counterintuitive for a politician that it worked. And if you could get the most cynical people ever about politicians are the reporters who have to cover them and watch them flip-flop depending on what audience they're speaking to. Harwood was symptomatic of some of the best reporters of that era who gave up reporting. David Halberstam, Bill Kovach. We could go on and name an endless list of names of journalists who fell in love and wrote valentines to Bobby Kennedy in the forms of books or actually going out and working for him. He turned people around.
So this was not your first book, and it's not going to be your last. You are at work on another book now. Tell us about that.
So it's a book that seems a bit too timely these days. It's a biography of a guy named Joe McCarthy, who created an interesting playbook in politics that I think the guy in the White House today is following in lots of ways. And I think that I'm really excited. He's not somebody I'll end up feeling as positive about probably as Bobby Kennedy, but an equally intriguing figure who started out as a Democrat and as a relative liberal and ended up as an ultimate Cold Warrior.
Yeah. You said before that it was actually doing the research for the Bobby Kennedy book that led you to this biography of Joe McCarthy?
It was. It was actually an interview with Ethel Kennedy, Bobby's widow, who said to me words that I'll never forget, which is that Joe McCarthy may have been a monster to much of America, but to us, he was a guy who came and charmed our toddler. And there's another side to Joe McCarthy, and I wanted to understand both sides of Joe McCarthy. Do
you get this impression, we only got about a minute and a half left here, but do you get an impression that that kind of relationship in American politics, sort of the Kennedys and the McCarthys, is that the stuff of ancient history? Is the idea that people from diametrically different perspectives in American politics can still come together and have these human relationships? Is this Is this fanciful?
So it's the stuff that looks like it's in our rearview mirror, and I hope it's in our future. And I think that if we look to models like Bobby Kennedy, that's one of the things we should come away with, the idea that that kind of dialogue has to happen again.
So when do we expect the book? I
So
wanna
my
read it
publisher
already.
expects it in about 9 months, and then a year after that, I hope we'll be out.
How do you write? Do you have a set schedule every day? Does this?
So I wake up in an ungodly hour, like 4 o'clock in the morning, and I write till I need to take
I
a
can
nap.
relate to
And
that, by
that's-
the way.
yeah, yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm fascinated. Just very quickly, when you go off and you find with Bobby Kennedy's case, you had a lot of people to talk to, a lot of people still alive. Same true with Joe McCarthy.
Fewer with Joe McCarthy, and it means I just have to work faster.
I understand that. Larry Ty, the book, Bobby Kennedy, it's remarkable. And thank you so much for being with us this week. That's all the time we have this week, but if you want to know more about Story in the Public Square, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, or visit pellcenter.org, where you can also catch up on previous episodes. For G. Wayne Miller, I'm Jim Ludis, inviting you to join us again next time for more Story in the Public Square.